So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Introduction to Culture Studies, where we're looking at Dick Hebdige's book, Subculture. And we stopped at the point where he began to look at ideology and he sort of began to articulate the importance of looking at ideology in any study of culture. And as I mentioned, we have already looked at ideology as a system of thought, a system of structures which are used to dominate, which are used to consolidate certain categories, certain functions. But it's one of those terms which we keep going back to in cultural studies. It's a very important term. It's a very loaded term in cultural studies. It's profoundly political. It's almost always discursive. I mean, it's discursive, and by default, it can't be otherwise. It can't operate otherwise. And also, it's quite experiential in quality. It's something which takes about phenomenal experiential quality as well. So it's one of those terms which do everything that culture as a system, culture as a phenomenon does. Okay, so this particular section which we will start out with today, it talks about, it relies entirely on an examination of ideology, and it draws on that examination in terms of looking at how that connects to culture and to broader structures of culture. So ideology, a lived relation. Again, look at the definition offered by Hebdige over here. It's a lived relation. There's a relational quality of ideology. It's relational in terms of how it connects to different structures, how it connects to different individuals, how it brings together individuals and structures and functions under one system. It's also a lived relation. It's something which is lived at a daily level, at an immediate level, at an experiential level. So to that extent, it is a lived relation. So in the German ideology, Marx shows how the basis of the capitalist economic structure, surplus value, neatly defined by Godley as profit, as unpaid work, is hidden from the consciousness of the agents of production, right? So that's one of the foundational books of ideology, the German ideology by Marx, where he talks about how the structures of economic control, the structures of capitalist production is hidden from the consciousness of the agents of production. So actually the workers never get to know the structures, and the workers never get to know the structures of production. So the workers who produce, the paid workers, sometimes the unpaid workers, who are the agents of production, they are completely divorced, they're completely kept away from the structures of production which govern any capitalist system. The failure to see through the apparatus, to see through appearances of the real relations which underlie them, does not occur as a direct result of some kind of masking operation consciously carried out by individuals, social groups, and institutions. On the contrary, ideology by definition thrives beneath consciousness. So ideology can only operate as long as you don't know it exists, as long as you don't know that it operates, right? And the moment you find out it's operating, you begin to question its presence, then you begin to question its constructive quality, and again you begin to question its very ontological status. But it will function as long as you don't question, as long as you're not aware of its existence. So on the contrary, ideology by definition thrives beneath consciousness. It's something which doesn't come to consciousness more often than not. It is here, at the level of normal common sense, that ideological frames of reference are most firmly sedimented and most effective, because it is here that the ideological nature is most effectively concealed. So common sense conceals constructed quality, as we have already seen it. So one of the functions of common sense as part of the ideological narrative is not questioning something and not questioning the constructed quality of something. It just accepts it as a given. It just accepts it as common sense, as something which is shared sense, right? So ideological qualities are more often than not embedded with common sense. The common sense narrative and the ideological narrative go hand in hand. They are sort of entwined together in a very organic, alchemical way, just so people are not aware, the agents of production are not aware of the structure of ideology, the nature of ideology, the constructed quality of ideology, etc. So these are sedimented and effective precisely because they're concealed, precisely because their constructed quality is concealed, and hence it operates beautifully and effectively and seamlessly and sinisterly, of course, as an ideological narrative. And now Hebdige draws on Stuart Hall, another great cultural critic, and he talks about how Hall defines ideology. Hall defines the spontaneous, organic quality of ideology, which is obviously a trick to make you believe there's a spontaneous, organic, commonsensical, natural thing. So the naturalness of ideology is part of the trick, because the naturalness conceals its constructed quality. It effaces the fact that it's a construct. It affects the fact that it's actually a narrative which is used to dominate other people, etc. You just accept it as a natural narrative, as a natural given. Okay, so this is Stuart Hall's definition of the organic, spontaneous quality of ideology. It is precisely its spontaneous quality, its transparency, its naturalness, its refusal to be made to examine the premises on which it is founded, its resistance to change or to correction, its effect of instant recognition, and the closed circle in which it moves, which makes common sense at one and the same time spontaneous, ideological, and unconscious. So these three terms are almost synonymous: spontaneous, ideological, and unconscious. It's unconscious because it's spontaneous. You're not aware of it. You're not aware of its ontological existence. You're not aware of its constructed quality. You're not aware of its surreptitious structures. You just accept it as a natural given, as part of your biological system, as part of, it's like breathing. You're not aware of oxygen because you breathe it naturally. And ideology operates in similar seamless structures, right? So it's spontaneous, ideological, and unconscious. So these are the three criteria of common sense. And common sense obviously becomes profoundly ideological, profoundly discursive in quality, because if we accept something as common sense, you will not subvert it, you will not question it, because it becomes part of the given narrative, right? And it's part of the spontaneous narrative, the spontaneous thought process. And if it's part of the spontaneous thought process, then how can you question it? If you question it, then you're rendered insane, you're rendered irrational, because it's part of the rational narrative, it's part of the spontaneous rational narrative, right? So this rationality and spontaneity narrative, it go hand in hand when it comes to ideological, apparatus, which operate more often than not at an unconscious, subliminal level. You don't question it, they don't appear in the consciousness threshold. You cannot learn through common sense how things are. You can only discover where they fit into the existing scheme of things. So again, how things are. So you don't understand how things are. So in other words, you can't question something ontologically. You can't question something, some particular phenomenon's ontological quality. You can't question why it is there in the first place. You just obsess with, you just engage with how they fit in and the existing scheme of things, and that's how ideological apparatus work. This is a success story of ideological apparatus according to Stuart Hall here. In this way, it's very taken for grantedness is what establishes it as a medium in which its own premises and presuppositions are being rendered invisible by its apparent transparency. So transparency becomes a strategic quality over here, and later on we'll do a section from Katherine Bell's Critical Practice, where she talks about opacity or lack of transparency, and how subversive language should be opaque in quality, how opacity becomes a subversive strategic function which is directed against transparency. So this transparency of common sense is something that part of the taken for grantedness of ideology, the taken for granted quality of ideology, the taken for granted quality of commonsensical ideology, which then establishes it as a medium in which its own premises and presuppositions are being rendered invisible. So the invisibility of ideology is part of the success story. The moment it becomes visible, then you realize it's a narrative, you realize it's a constructed quality, and then you realize it's not actually transparent, it's opaque, it's something which can be attacked, something which can be questioned in its own way. So, transparency, spontaneity, invisibility, naturalness, taken for granted qualities. So these become the synonyms, the markers for any ideological system which will operate at an unconscious level. You're not conscious of it. You're not conscious of how the structures are formed. You're not conscious of how the structures are replicated. And more importantly, you're not conscious of how the structures are internalized without questioning. Right? And that becomes the entire taken for grantedness, which informs ideology in the first place. Okay, so since ideology saturates everyday discourse in the form of common sense, it cannot be bracketed off from everyday life as a self-contained set of political opinions or biased views. So it's so embedded, it's so organically embedded with common sense, and that forms a part of everyday discourse, that it cannot be separated as a different kind of an instrument which then can be critiqued and questioned. It cannot be seen as a political opinion or a biased view. So ideology operates, common sense by its very ontological quality is unbiased in quality, right? And this unbiased quality is also part of the trick, of course, because unbiased quality is part of the transparency, spontaneity narrative, right? Because the moment you realize there's bias in quality, you begin to question it. You begin to question the bias, then you begin to find out the dogmatic quality of common sense. You begin to find out the structured quality of common sense, etc., and the opinionated quality of common sense. So political opinions and biased views, they are very carefully effaced in any understanding of common sense. Okay, so neither can it be reduced to the abstract dimensions of a worldview or used in a crude Marxist sense to designate false consciousness. Instead, as Louis Althusser has pointed out, so Althusser, of course, is someone who we have used already as a foundational, as one of the really important and seminal figures in cultural studies, not least in his ideas for ISA and RSA, which you should remember are very important categories in cultural studies: ideological state apparatus and repressive state apparatus. So Hebdige over here is drawing on Althusser. He is quoting Althusser over here, and this is a quotation of Althusser, the quotation about ideology, which is one of the most important and most complex definitions of ideology ever offered. And this is it. Ideology has very little to do with consciousness. It's profoundly unconscious. Ideology is indeed a system of representation, but in the majority of cases, these representations have nothing to do with consciousness. They're usually images and occasionally concepts, but it is above all structures that they impose on the vast majority of men, not via their consciousness. They are perceived, accepted, suffered cultural objects, and they act functionally on men via a process that escapes them. Right? So the unconscious quality of ideology is what Althusser is highlighting over here. And he's saying these representations have nothing to do with consciousness. They are, they are structures that are imposed on a vast majority of men, not via consciousness. So they're accepted, they're suffered, they're internalized as cultural objects, and they act functionally on men via a process that escapes them. So the process, the constructed quality, the grammar of construction, the structured quality is what is completely effaced from the ideological apparatus, and men just internalize it, enact it, embody it without questioning it. So it's a purely functional internalization thing, and it's got nothing to do with consciousness at all. So it is unconscious, it escapes consciousness, and that's one of the conditions of ideology. It's profoundly unconscious, as Althusser points out quite clearly. Although Althusser is here referring to structures like the family, cultural and political institutions, etc., we can illustrate the point quite simply by taking as an example a physical structure. Most modern institutions of education, despite the apparent neutrality of the materials from which they are constructed, red brick, white tile, etc., carry within themselves implicit ideological assumptions which are literally structured into the architecture itself. So now Hebdige is offering a really fascinating example of how ideology operates even in the most in places which we don't realize it's there. So even in architecture of a building, so whether a university is made out of red bricks or white tile, that will illustrate a particular ideology of conservatism or new age architecture. So architecture is profoundly ideological. How a building is made, how a building is designed, how a building is painted. So these become ideological questions. I mean, the only problem is we don't realize these are ideological in the first place, and we just accept it as neutral, as non-ideological or political, non-discursive, etc. But the point is, they come in no ideology-free zone, no ideology-free space, according to Hebdige over here. And it draws on Althusser in order to corroborate his point. And that is, every act of construction, whether it's a building construction, a narrative construction, a story construction, a religion construction, nation construction, is profoundly ideological in quality. And the better the construction is, the more it will efface its constructed quality, the more it will hide and conceal its constructed quality. So that becomes part of the ideological narrative. Right, so these ideological assumptions are literally structured into the architecture itself. The categorization of knowledge into arts and sciences is reproduced in the faculty system, which houses different disciplines in different buildings. And most colleges maintain the traditional divisions by devoting a separate floor to each subject. So again, how academic offices are mapped out, how academic offices are laid and designed by disciplines, how the disciplines are kept separate from each other, how they're brought together. So for instance, humanities, sciences, social studies, how these different disciplines are situated and located in a particular building. So these become profoundly ideological systems. Of course, we don't realize it's ideological. These decisions are so innate and so they appear so organic that we are not conscious of the ideological quality that is invested into it. Okay, so moreover, the hierarchical relationship between teacher and taught is inscribed in a very layout lecture theatre, where the seating arrangements, benches rising on tiers before a raised lectern, dictate the flow of information and serve to naturalize professorial authority. So the entire idea of authority is naturalized. So for instance, even inside a lecture hall, the way a lecture hall is laid out, that becomes profoundly ideological in quality. So the way a lectern, the professor stands at a particular lectern, a particular dais, and the way the students are seated in a particular room, these become profoundly ideological in the sense that these are used to facilitate the flow of information and to naturalize professorial authority. So authority is naturalized, information is spontaneously delivered, and that's the whole aim of this ideological construction. So the word construction over here is used literally, can be used literally for architectural purposes, for discursive purposes, etc. And the whole point is how something so seemingly non-political as architecture, building design, the offices in a particular department, so how these also are arranged ideologically without our knowing it, without our understanding of the structures that are invested into these decisions, right? So there's a whole range of decisions about what is and what is not possible within education have been made, however, unconsciously before the content of individual courses is even decided. So even before a course is designed, even before the content of a course is designed, the way a lecture hall is constructed, the way a particular office is constructed, the way a particular department is constructed, these become ideological. So, you know, even before we read a single page in a particular course, we are already inside an ideological system and we can't escape that particular system. So there's no ideology-free zones, even in a seemingly innocuous, seemingly non-political space, like, for instance, a lecture hall. We realize if you look at it from this particular perspective, this culture studies perspective, a lecture hall becomes profoundly ideological in quality, especially in the way it's designed to naturalize power, to normalize power differences, normalize gender differences, naturalize gender differences, etc. Right? So these decisions help us to set the limits not only on what is taught, but on how it is taught. So not just the what of bit, but also the how bit, the manner in which something is taught. So the ontological quality as well as the functional quality, they become ideological together. Here the buildings literally reproduce in concrete terms prevailing ideological notions about what education is. And it is through this process that the educational structure, which can of course be altered, is placed beyond question and appears to us as a given, that is as immutable. So this immutable quality is something which is the part of the success story of ideology. So every act of ideology in ideological construction is aimed towards creating and consolidating and maintaining this immutable quality, right? So the entire structure of a building, the entire structure of a lecture hall, how buildings literally reproduce in concrete terms. Obviously there's a pun in the concrete over here. It's a concretization of ideology as well as a real architecture made through concrete, through which the ideological functions are consolidated. So these become part of the given quality of ideology, the immutable quality of ideology. In this case, the frames of our thinking have been translated into actual bricks and mortar. So the actual bricks and mortar, the actual construction material, these are externalization of the way of thought, the processes of thinking that operate inside ideological systems. Social relations and processes are then appropriated by individuals only through the forms in which they are represented to those individuals. These forms are, as we have seen, by no means transparent. They appear transparent, but they are not transparent. So transparency becomes a part of the ideological narrative over here. They are shrouded in a common sense which simultaneously validates and mystifies them. So this is the function of common sense. It has this validating quality. So if something is classified as common sense, then you don't question it because it's common sense. It's part of the given narrative. But at the same time, it also mystifies certain things. It makes it something more mystical, something more mysterious. So common sense has this dual function of validation and to make something more mystical. This mystic quality, this mystifying function and a validating function, they go hand in hand when it comes to common sense. It is precisely these perceived, accepted, suffered cultural objects which semiotics sets out to interrogate and decipher. right? So, semiotics sets out to interact and decipher what is internalized subjects. So, internalization, interpolation, these become very important categories in ideology. And semiotics, the whole purpose of semiotics is to examine the coded quality and to sort of unpack these codes. Okay. All aspects of culture possess a semiotic value, and the most taken for granted phenomena can function as signs, as elements in communication system governed by semantic rules and codes which are not themselves directly apprehended in appearance. These signs then are as opaque as the social relations which produce them and which they represent. In other words, there is an ideological dimension to every signification. So this final sentence is very, very important, and it sort of sums up what Hebdige is attempting to communicate over here, that every act of signification has an ideological dimension, has an ideological investment, right? So there's an ideological dimension to every signification. So meaning making is an ideological process. So signification is, of course, meaning making. And meaning making is often part of this mythologizing function. It's part of this mythological economy in which certain meanings become more important than other meanings. And the hierarchy, the semantic hierarchy, is defined by sort of imaginary and ideological imaginary, which is invested into this act of signification. Okay, and this is a quotation from Volosinov that Hebdige is offering over here. A sign does not simply exist as part of reality. It reflects and refracts another reality. So it has an intertextual quality. Every sign is connected to every other sign in a reflective and refractive capacity. Okay? Therefore, it may distort that reality or be true to it, or may perceive it from a special point of view, and so forth. Every sign is subject to the criteria of ideological evaluation. The domain of ideology coincides with the domain of science. They equate with one another. Whenever a sign is present, ideology is present too. Everything ideological possesses a semiotic value. So the semiotic quality and the ideological quality of a sign are wedded together. But oftentimes we're obsessed with semiotic quality because the ideological quality is more concealed. It operates better if it's concealed. So every sign is a refraction of reality. Every sign is a distortion of reality, and this distortion or authentication, it depends on a particular point of view. And every sign is subject to the criteria of ideological evaluation. So ideological evaluation should be used to study every sign. So the domain of ideology coincides with the domain of science. So semiotic and ideological quality, they are sort of wedded together, like you said. They equate with one another. There's this equation between semiotics and ideology, and that's something which must be considered when we're looking at culture as a semiotic system. So it can't be a purely semiotic system, which is divorced from ideology. So semiotics is part of the ideological process. How a particular structure is coded, how a particular event is coded. There's this coding process. That coding process itself is ideological quality. So for instance, if you go back to the example that Hebdige just offered, in terms of how the offices in a particular department are laid out, economic discipline. So that's part of a coding process, right? So the arrangement of offices in a building is a coding process. It could be an academic office, it could be a company office where the manager sits somewhere, the typist sits somewhere else, the secretary sits somewhere else. So the sitting arrangement, the office arrangement is part of the code. Now this particular code is obviously ideological by default. So this particular quotation by Volosinov corroborates it. So the coded quality, the entire semiotic quality of a particular system has by default an ideological quality. So the semiotics is dependent on ideology and vice versa. It's part of an organic loop process. And we can't study one without divorcing the other if we are to do a serious culture studies experiment or culture studies analysis of a particular event or a particular space. Okay, so to uncover the ideological dimension of science, we must first try to disentangle the codes through which meaning is organized. So the whole idea is to disentangle the codes. So the codes have been entangled in a particular way, and that particular manner is ideological in quality. So if we are to uncover the ideological dimension of science, we must disentangle the codes. We must, uncode, decode the codes through which meaning is organized. So the organization of meaning, or meaning formation, is a deeply ideological system, and there's sort of that particular code of meaning formation must be decoded. So connotative codes are particularly important. Hidden, connotative is hidden, so underlying codes, implicit codes. So connotative codes are particularly important, as Stuart Hall has argued. They cover the face of social life and render it classifiable, intelligible, meaningful. So the meaningful, intelligible, classifiable quality of connotative codes is very, very important, because it's part of a implicit process of intelligibility, right? It's how intelligent meaning is produced through certain implicit structures. So this implicit quality of connotative codes is something that is highlighted by Hall, and this is echoed by Hebdige OAL. He goes on to describe these codes as maps of meaning, which are of necessity the product of selection. So again, selection becomes a very ideological decision. How a certain code is selected, how a certain code is selected, brought together, permutated, combined. So the combination of codes become an ideological process, an ideological decision. So again, we can use example of a building of offices to corroborate a point. How is certain office is structured? How is a hierarchy in an office structured through the architecture of the office space, which is obviously our code, but that particular code is quite ideological in quality. And so this maps of meaning. So the speciality of ideology, the speciality of codes is something which must be highlighted and studied in an examination of this collusion between ideology and semiotics. They cut across a range of potential meanings, making certain meanings available and ruling others out of code. We tend to live inside these maps as surely as we live in the real world. They think as much as we think of them, as we think them, and this in itself is quite natural. So naturalization of ideology, naturalization of this collusion between semiotics and ideology is something which is very important for the purpose of cultural studies. All human societies reproduce themselves in this way through a process of naturalization. It is through this process a kind of inevitable reflex of all social life that particular sets of social relations, particular ways of organizing the world appear to us as if they were universal and timeless. So this is something which we have been saying and discussing from the very inception of this course, and how the particularity of a certain even, how a particular even, a certain topical even, how that becomes a grand narrative, how that becomes a universal given, a timeless universal given. And that's precisely because of this complete and clinical collusion between semiotics and ideology. So the more clinical, the more successful, the more complete this collusion is, this combination is, the more timeless and the more natural and the more unquestionable that particular combination would appear to us. This is what Althusser means when he says that ideology has no history, and that ideology in this general sense will always be an essential element of every social formation. So in an interesting sense, ideologies are historical because ideology always happens. It's a timeless process. It happens all the time, this combination of semiotics and discursive formation, right? And ideology in this general sense will always be an essential element of every social formation. So every social formation, every activity, every social activity, every dominant activity, every social structure relies on this ideological formation, ideological combination, and that's something which makes ideology is something without history. It's not just happening now. It did not just happen back then. It's happening all the time. So in that sense, ideology has no history. So it's a very paradoxical and slightly provocative thing to say, but actually this is what Althusser is saying, that because it happens all the time, in a perverse way, it becomes timeless in quality, right? Okay. However, in highly complex societies like ours, which function through a finely graded system of divided and specialized labor, the crucial question has to do with which specific ideologies representing the interests of which specific groups and classes will prevail at any given moment in any given situation. So Hebdige draws attention to our society today. Obviously this is written in the 80s, 70s, but it's sort of true to our times as well. When he says that in our society, specialized labor becomes very important, right? Everything is graded and specialized and hyper-specialized to a certain extent. So certain kinds of labor become more important than certain other kinds of labor. So in that sense, ideology will have a gradation. Certain specific groups and classes will prevail at any given moment in any given situation. To deal with this question, we must first consider how power is distributed in our society. So power, the question of power, a study of examination of power becomes very important in terms of looking at how it is distributed in society. That is, we must ask which groups and classes have now much say in defining, ordering, and classifying out the social world. For instance, if we pause to reflect for a moment, it should be obvious that access to the means by which ideas are disseminated in a society, that is principally the mass media, is not the same for all classes. Some groups have more say, more opportunity to make the rules, to organize meaning, while others are less favorably placed, have less power to produce and impose the definitions of the world on the world. So the question of agency becomes key over here, because, and this is something which we have already touched upon to a certain extent, the relationship between ideology and agency. So whereas every moment is ideological, every activity is ideological, certain activities are more important than certain other activities because they include people who are more important, more privileged, economically privileged, racially privileged, culturally privileged. And so the question of privilege extends naturally onto the question of agency. You know, which people have more say, which systems have more say, which groups have more say to organize meanings, to multiply the meanings, to permute and combine the meanings, to make the rules. So the question of favor, the question of agency becomes organically connected to the question of ideology. Right. Thus we come to we look beneath the level of ideology in general at the way in which specific ideologies work, how some gain dominance and some remain marginal. So this, again, some ideologies become dominant ideologies, hegemonic formations, whereas some ideologies remain marginal, they're not unimportant. We can see that in advanced Western democracies, the ideological field is by no means neutral. So even in advanced Western democracies which boast of an impartial democratic world, we find the ideological fields are by no means neutral. They're highly biased, they're highly partisan, in the sense that the question of agency becomes very important where certain ideological fields become dominant, more mainstream, more hegemonic, more visible, whereas certain other ideological fields become more marginal precisely because they don't have the agency, the required agentic status in order to propel them, in order to sort of make them dominant. To return to the connotative codes to which Stuart Hall refers when we see that these maps of meaning are charged with a potentially explosive significance because they are traced and retraced along the lines laid down by the dominant discourses about reality, the dominant ideologies. They thus tend to represent, in however obscure and contradictory fashion, the interests of the dominant groups of society, right? So the question of dominance becomes very important over here because dominant ideologies will represent the dominant groups of society. And maps of meaning, too, become quite hierarchical in quality. Certain maps of meaning become more important because they have more ideological investment, they have more agentic investments, they have more discursive investments, which make them dominant in quality. So, you know, that's how this hierarchy happens. So this is a quotation of Marx that Hebdige offers at this point. To understand this point, we should refer to Marx, and this is a quotation on your screen. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, a class which is a ruling material force of society is at the same time as a ruling intellectual force. So again, the question of materiality and abstraction become important. So the intellectual force are also the more powerful force, and that's how they collude together. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time, or the means of mental production. So mental production and material production go hand in hand. So the class which has more means, more control of the material production will automatically and axiomatically have more control over the mental production. So again, we're looking at entanglement of materiality and abstraction with which we started off in this particular course, and this is corroborated by the great Karl Marx. Okay, so that generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than an ideal expression of the dominant material relationships grasped as ideas. Hence, relationships which make the one class the ruling class, therefore the ideas of its dominance. So the ideational dominance and the material dominance go hand in hand, according to Marx and Engels over here. So the ruling class also control the mental production, the ideas, production at the level of ideas, ideological production, in other words. So material production and ideological production go hand in hand. So people who produce things more materially, people who have more control, more economic control over material production, they automatically exert more control over the ideational climate, the ideational category, the ideational field, which constitutes that particular epoch. And that's true for every epoch, every human historical point. And in that sense, it goes back to Althusser's idea where he says ideology has no history, because this happens all the time. This has happened throughout human history. In that sense, it's not really historically sensitive. It's happening, it will happen through all societies in different degrees of combination. This is the basis of Antonio Gramsci's theory of hegemony, which provides the most adequate account of how dominance is sustained in advanced capitalist society. So, this brings Hebdige to the idea of hegemony, which is formulated and theorized by Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, where he goes on to say a very complex study, the most adequate account of Hebdige's analysis of how dominance is sustained at advanced capitalist society, how dominance comes into being, how dominance is enacted, embodied in capitalist societies, and that happens to acts of hegemony. And this is the point which we will continue with in the next lecture, hegemony, the moving equilibrium, which should be our next topic of study in the next lecture. And we stop at this point today, and we'll continue with this in the lectures to come. Thank you for your attention.